So now we're up to lecture 5 in Rudolf Steiner's commentary on the Gospel of Mark. And in this chapter, he doesn't talk very much about the Gospel of Mark. Instead, he talks about the character of Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita and the Buddha's relationship to him as a kind of hearkening back to Krishna. I think Steiner is at his best when he is working on the Western tradition, discoursing on Western ideas. And I think he's at his weakest when he starts talking about Eastern ideas, because I think then the shadow side of theosophy that he has sort of inherited from them and never quite gets rid of is evident insofar as what we end up with when he discusses Eastern ideas is mostly a very shallow and trivial form of syncretism. Syncretism is religious. It's a very late religious development when traditions start getting combined together in a higgledy-piggledy sort of hodgepodge way, as happened during the late period in the Hellenistic civilization, about the time of the Romans, about the time of the Roman Empire, when syncretism, we start getting all these weird cults appear that are amalgamations of other cults together. So we get this, during this whole Roman imperial period here, these first few centuries AD, we start getting a profusion of very bizarre cults all over the place that have combined each other's symbols together. And you just end up with a mess when you do that. So I think every time Steiner borrows terms from India, they're fine when he repurposes them or reterritorializes them, like the terms for manas, buddhi, and atman. Steiner uses the atman to characterize the highest of his sort of chakras, you might say, the spirit body, and then below that the life spirit, which is the buddhi, and the spirit self, which is the manas. But those terms do not mean in Steiner what they mean in Sanskrit. Manas means the intellect in the Sanskrit world, the Indian world. Manas is the mind, whereas the buddhi is a sort of interior perceptual intelligence that's akin to intuition. And the Atman, of course, it's not even the soul, it's just the individual microcosm of the Brahman, which is just sort of a white flash. It's kind of predicateless, except insofar as you can say that it's Satchitananda, being, consciousness, and bliss, which are predicates of it. But nonetheless, so I think that in Steiner's very problematic idea here that Krishna, and the only Krishna that he knows at this point is the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, which was very popular in theosophical circles, is older than the Buddha by several centuries, he says, and that the Buddha is really hearkening back to him. In a certain sense, doesn't work at all. The Bhagavad Gita is a much later text, comes most likely after the lifetime of the Buddha. The Buddha is around 500 BC, thereabouts. And the Buddha also presupposes the system of atheistic philosophy known as Sankhya, atheistic but still metaphysical. It's not nihilistic the way the Buddhist ideas are very nihilistic. The Sankhya has been synthesized in the Bhagavad Gita together with the Vedic Aryan traditions, along with as well as the native developments of yoga that lead in the Upanishads to the monistic idea of Brahman as a universal energy of which everything is a manifestation. And Steiner quotes here the passage from the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna is the charioteer of Arjuna, who is about to go into battle against all of his cousins. And they're right at the moment before the battle starts, and Arjuna has misgivings about the slaughter that's about to take place. And Krishna is his charioteer, who's the 8th incarnation of Vishnu, then goes in the 10th book of the Bhagavad Gita, then goes into a very broad exposition in which the synthesis of these ideas occur. The Sankhya is dualistic, not monistic, so it differs from the Vedic, not the Rig Vedic tradition, but the tradition that comes in and sort of gets synthesized when Yajnavalkya introduces yoga in the Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya Upanishads, and the accent shifts from the priestly world of performing the rites in the Vedas to the world of the Upanishads, in which meditation and yoga are the primary means of achieving and accessing the oneness of the Atman with the Brahman, to achieve this sort of monistic, very non-dualistic oneness. In Sankhya, we have the dualism of Prakriti and Purusha, which are its ultimate metaphysical terms, and it provides a cosmogony by way of which the world comes into being that is very complex, but it's the first atheistic cosmogony in India. It dates from about 600 BC, so it's about a century before the Buddha. And the idea is that the Purusha is not the Atman. The Atman is monistic. The Purusha is the indwelling sort of monad of the individual's ultimate self. It's a kind of monad that interacts with Prakriti, which is matter, and matter is characterized and destabilized by the presence within it of three gunas. And the gunas are Sattva guna, which has to do with pure spiritual clarity, Rajas guna, which then has to do with fiery, passionate activity, and Tamas guna, which has to do with torpor and inertia. It's the darkest of the three and the heaviest, and they correspond to the colors that you would guess: white for Sattva, red for Rajas guna, black for Tamas guna. And these are the three qualities that are inherent in matter, in Prakriti, which when the Purusha incarnates and enters into Prakriti, it destabilizes these gunas, and you wind up with the physical material world. And the idea through the practice of Jnana Marga, which is the pathway of intelligence, is to realize that they're two separate things, that the Purusha can be cleansed of its attachments to the realm of the gunas and Prakriti and become realized as a kind of crystal white sphere that then ascends. And so it's dualistic. It never achieves the monism, which is achieved by the Vedic Upanishadic tradition. But all of this is brought together in a grand synthesis, which is not syncretistic. It's not a sloppy mess, but it's brought together in the Bhagavad Gita with the realization of karma yoga, which is the primary idea in the Bhagavad Gita, in which Krishna basically tells Arjuna, don't worry about it. Karma yoga is the performance of your actions with renunciation for the fruits of those actions. If you're a warrior, do your duty. Be a warrior. Fight. But it's one thing to perform your duty, and it's another thing to crave or lust for the results. That would be an increase of Rajas guna. And these correspond to temperaments and also tastes in food. They each have a predominance of one of these three gunas. The man who prefers healthy foods has a predominance of Sattva guna in his temperament. The man who prefers sweet, salty, spicy foods has a predominance of Rajas guna, and the one who likes leftovers, old smelly food, is the one in whom Tamas guna predominates. Likewise, you could probably, I believe you can connect them to the famous three gods. Sattva guna would correspond to Vishnu, who dreams the world into being, and from out of his navel comes the lotus upon which the god Brahma sits, not Brahman with an N, which is the ultimate monistic energy, but the god Brahma, who then would correspond to Rajas, who brings the world of desires into being, you might say. And Shiva, of course, corresponds to Tamas, the dark deity who haunts the burial grounds. That's his world, the dark, filthy, unclean world. So these three gunas are brought together in this idea of karma yoga, with the idea that how they resolve this is by saying that the dualism of Purusha and Prakriti is retained, but it's retained only within the physical world, but that the ultimate realization is still Brahman. When Krishna says, I am everything that is, and that everything has come forth from me, that's the Upanishadic monism, of which the Purusha, as a singular monad, is simply a manifestation on the physical sensory plane of the ultimate, the Brahman. And so they're brought together with karma yoga and also with bhakti yoga, which is the performance of devotion to a favorite deity. That's the lowest and most popular form of yoga. You just perform offerings to your favorite deity. That's a popular form of yoga. But the karma yoga is a little more sophisticated. And then, of course, the Raja yoga, even more than that, which is the kingly yoga that is the famous one, which has the unification of Atman with Brahman. So all of this is brought together in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a relatively late text, but it presupposes that it's fully aware of Sankhya and fully aware of the Upanishadic tradition, which is brought together. And it's within the Mahabharata, which is the world's largest epic, which is 18 volumes long, and dates from somewhere vaguely between 400 BC and 400 AD. It's very difficult to date anything in India because This was, as Spengler says in The Decline of the West, a culture that has a kind of ahistorical mentality where the world is just a dream and doesn't really exist. It does not have a historical mentality. It doesn't keep track of dates. So it's very difficult to date texts. But nonetheless, it is possible that Krishna, the name is older than Buddha for certain. There's a character in the Chandogya Upanishad who's named Krishna, but it's not the same character as Arjuna's charioteer, who's a scholar in the Chandogya Upanishad. And the name just means black. So the name is older, but we're not sure how far back it goes. Clearly, he is connected with the epic of the Pandava brothers, which is the Mahabharata, and may go back to it in oral tradition. Writing always comes late. Myths are written down in almost every case when people are forgetting them, and there's an anxiety that they're about to disappear, as Steiner actually alludes in this chapter, in this lecture too. So he has this idea that the Buddha then, so Krishna still is within the world of the sentient soul, the mythical consciousness structure, and then he has the Buddha coming a few centuries after him and sort of yearning back for the world. He is nostalgic for the world of Krishna, and he is yearning back for that ultimate insight of Krishna's, and he has this new doctrine of self-salvation, attaining nirvana, that will lead you back to that world. That's totally dead wrong. The thing about the Buddha is his nihilism. He's blowing that world out, as we said last time. He's blowing out not only the candle of the soul, but the whole pictorial universe of the sentient soul, the mythical consciousness structure. He's wiping that out. So it's very unlikely that he's hearkening back to, he's not hearkening back to, certainly not to Krishna, and definitely not to that whole world. The Buddha is born in the city of Kapila Vastu, which is named after Kapila, who is known as the founder of Sankhya. It means the red one, and it may be a reference to the sun, actually. So it's clear that the Sankhya is already well up and running by the time the Buddha comes on the scene. So it's very unlikely that Krishna antedates him as a character. And the Bhagavata Purana, which is the great epic of Krishna's life and deeds, also comes later even than that. And the whole reason that Steiner sets this up by having this idea of the Buddha hearkening back, the Buddha is sort of finishing up the age of the sentient soul within the period of the intellectual soul and hearkening back to the world of Krishna, is so that he can then say, now take a look at John the Baptist. And what John the Baptist is doing is hearkening to one who will come after him. He's preparing the way for the Christ. He's looking ahead. The Buddha's looking backward. And he's looking ahead, saying, behold, one who will come after me. Right at the beginning of the Mark Gospel, behold, one who will come after me, who will be greater than I. If I baptize you by water, he will baptize you by the fire of the Spirit, and so forth. And so that seems to be the main point of the chapter and its upshot. And notice that Christ starts right in, there is no 40 days in the wilderness as in the other Gospels, where after John baptizes him, he then wanders by himself for 40 days in the wilderness and undergoes the 3 temptations of Satan. That's not here in the Mark Gospel. The moment that Mark baptizes him, he's off and running at Capernaum, performing exorcisms and miracles. He just gets right going. So that whole section is not even, that's clearly a later edition, which is why I like the Mark Gospel, because it's the simplest and it's the most stripped down and pared down version of the events of the life of Christ. So that's this chapter, and there's not much to it. Again, I think that Steiner is at his weakest when he moves into this theosophical syncretism and starts discussing ideas about India that he doesn't, with all due respect, he doesn't really understand. The ideas of Indian philosophy just was not a specialty of his, and there's a certain triteness about it. But that's this chapter, and next he'll move into, but it does prepare the foundation for, in the next chapter, the contrast that we'll see between the historical conceptions of the Magian world, the Judeo-Christian Islamic world, which follows the development of history as a single shot and emphasizes the non-repeatability and singularities of events. The life of Christ cannot ever happen again, and Steiner does not ever have him reincarnating again. For Christ to reincarnate would be to miss the whole point of the incarnation as the Golgotha event that transforms the earth and transubstantiates it. We always have access to that event. There's no need for him to reincarnate. Versus the Indian conception, which is always cyclical. Everything has repeated. Everything that has happened, Everything that can ever happen has already happened a billion times before. And the world is just a cycle that moves through the four yugas over and over again. Which moves through the Krita Yuga, the Trita Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and then finally the Kali Yuga. So we'll look at those in the next lecture.